Garry Kasparov cuts the board in half in this game against Ulf Andersson, played in Tilburg in 1981. Now, Ulf Andersson, if you're not familiar, was one of the safest chess players really in chess history, and he was one of the top players in the world at the time this game was played, and he was almost impossible to beat. His basic thesis was safety first, safety first, safety first, and no one could penetrate his defenses until the freight train known as Garry Kasparov came into view. And in this game, Ulf Andersson, well, he was in for a big surprise. In fact, Garry Kasparov said after this game that after this crushing defeat, Andersson was never able to play normally against me again. Let's jump right in. Garry Kasparov has white, begins with d4. Ulf Andersson plays knight to f6, c4, e6, and here knight to f3. Garry Kasparov avoids knight to c3 in the Nimzo-Indian, and Ulf Andersson plays b6, or the Queen's Indian defense. In this position, both sides are fighting over this key e4 square. a3, the idea is Kasparov wants to develop the knight to c3, but not allow this bishop to b4 pin on that knight, and in that way indirectly control the e4 square. Bishop to b7, again aiming at e4, knight to c3, and now knight to e4 was played by Ulf Andersson. The main move then, and I think, and still today, is d5, but this was Ulf Andersson's preferred move. Kasparov takes it, bishop takes, and then knight to d2. Hitting that bishop, the idea is you kick the bishop away and then prepare to advance e4 yourself. The main move is bishop to b7, but Ulf Andersson plays the move bishop to g6 instead. And Garry Kasparov did not like this move. He thought that the bishop was just too much of a target on g6, and it shouldn't give up this long diagonal. And here Kasparov immediately plays g3. The idea is, since black has abandoned that diagonal, he'll play the bishop to g2 and control it himself. It also supports an h-pawn advancing and making this bishop on g6 very comfortable, and it is the modern engine's first choice, even to this very day, the move g3. Knight to c6, attacking the d4 pawn, e3 defending. And here, the best move, or maybe the best idea for Ulf Andersson would have been to play e5, and challenge the center immediately. He needs to get a stake in the center of the board, but instead he plays a6. It's a little too passive, playing on the side of the board. Kasparov gains space with b4. Then Ulf Andersson plays b5. He wants to attack these light squares on the queen's side and establish a presence there. Pawn takes, and Kasparov cannot take this pawn on b5 right now because of knight takes b4, taking advantage of the pin down the a file. So instead, he plays bishop to b2. Now, there is no pin down the a file because the rook at a1 is defended. So he is threatening bishop takes b5. He thought the best way to defend was rook to b8. Although after rook to c1, he has a lot of uncomfortable pressure down the c file. But instead, Ulf Andersson plays knight to a7. And this is a very important moment to pay attention in this game. This knight is on the side of the board. It is offside. He's using it to defend the b5 square. And I want you to see how Kasparov is able to lock that knight out of the game and make it very difficult for Ulf Andersson to get it back into the game. h4, threatening h5, harassing this bishop. And here, Ulf Andersson played h6. Kasparov did not love this move. The problem is it's going to allow him to establish control over g6 after he later plays h4, h5. And here, Kasparov makes another brilliant move that is the top choice of modern engines. He plays the move d5. Now, of course, this opens up the long diagonal for this bishop at b2, making it very hard for the bishop at f8 to develop. But more importantly, it cuts the board in half. After pawn takes pawn, bishop g2, hitting that pawn, Ulf Andersson defends it with c6. And now look at this knight on a7. Black's queenside pieces are locked out of the play. Kasparov has he's divided the board into two sectors. You got the king side and the queen side, and he's going to move his pieces over to the king side, and Ulf Andersson is not going to be able to get his queenside pieces over because he's cut the board in half with this construction of pawns that he has forced to occur on the board. Castle's kingside. Now f6. He wants to be able to develop this bishop on f8 and blunt this bishop on b2 because the bishop was aiming at g7. If you move the bishop from f8, he could have taken on g7. Now rook to e1, threatening to open up the e-file because the king is stuck in the middle of the board. Modern engines do have an improvement here, actually. They show that you can play e4 immediately without preparing it with rook to e1, and after de4, queen to g4 was even stronger than what was played in the game, but that's definitely modern computer stuff. Rook to e1 makes a lot more sense, threatening to play e3, e4, and now bishop to e7, blocking that e-file, and now Ulf Andersson might have been taking a bit of a deep breath here. Finally, he can castle in peace and consolidate his position. Not so fast. Queen to g4. No rest for Grandmaster Andersson. Kasparov attacks the bishop at g6, and he's got to do something about it. King to f7. If he moves the bishop, then the g7 pawn would hang. Now, h5. We talked earlier about the problem with this h6 move. Now the g6 square is really going to be a problem for black. Kasparov plays h5, sort of clamping down on that square with tempo. The bishop moves to h7. Now e4, pawn takes, and bishop takes e4. Since Andersson has weak light squares around the king, Kasparov wants to trade off the only piece that defends those squares, which is the bishop on h7. You get that bishop off of the board, and those light squares are going to be that much more vulnerable. Bishop takes e4, knight takes e4. Now one more move, rook a to d1, and every single white piece will be involved in the attack. And look at our friends over here on a7 and a8. Still on the side of the board and not involved in the play. So knight to c8. Ulf Andersson is going to try to get that knight back into the position so it can defend a little bit. Rook a to d1. Both rooks are fully mobilized. Rook to a7 helps defend laterally and put some defense on d7. And then here comes an amazing shot from Kasparov. One of those tactics where you just sort of scratch your head and say, there's only one guy in the world that can play chess like this. Knight takes f6. Looks like that pawn is perfectly defended, but it is not. If black retakes with the bishop, then queen g6 check, king g8, you take the bishop, and you can't take with the queen because then you get mated. But after retaking with the pawn, here's the final move in the variation that Kasparov saw that allowed him to play knight f6. Boom, rook to e6, threatening rook to f6 and taking advantage of the fact that there's a pin along the d-file. Truly an amazing concept. And because of that, it forces Ulf Andersson to recapture the knight with the pawn, gf6. But now queen to g6 check, and he's all in on those light squares with his queen. The king goes back to f8, which is forced. And here, a white changes targets. The pawn on f6 is defended twice. So now he plays bishop to c1, aiming at the h6 pawn, threatening bishop takes h6 check, and that would force black to exchange for his rook. d5 is played, and now rook to d4. He needs to get one more piece into the action. The threat is rook to g4, followed by queen to g7 check, and picking up the rook on h8, among other things. And again, it is the computer's top move in this position. Knight to d6. So, Ulf Andersson's knight has made the journey from a7 to c8 to d6, and if he can place it on f7 right now, he actually would be consolidating the position and would probably be able to survive this. However, it is not his move. And after rook to g4, he is in huge, huge trouble. He plays knight to f7 anyway, but now here comes another one of Garry's brilliant shots. Bishop takes h6 check. The pawn can be taken in two different ways, but if rook takes, then queen to g8 is checkmate. And if the knight takes, queen g7 check, king over, queen takes rook check, and Garry wins the house. He's up material, he's got the passed h-pawn, the game would be over. So essentially, king to e8 is forced, but then bishop to g7. And with Ulf Andersson's clock about to fall, he resigned in this position, but there's no way to hold the game. If he tries to save the rook by playing rook to g8, then h6, and the pawn just advances, and Garry Kasparov would sort of just win everything. A brilliant performance. Garry cuts the board in half, and he attacks the safest player on the planet at this time. A brilliant attacking game. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon.